Okay, we continue with the program. It's the second symposium with the title Humans in the Wild, Sensing, Modeling, and Shaping Everyday Behavior. I want to start with introducing our first speaker. It is James Cotton. He's an electrical engineer, a neuroscientist, physiologist working in a physician scientist at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, and he's an assistant professor at the Northwestern University at the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. His work is on the intersection of artificial intelligence, wearable sensors, computer vision, causal and mechanical modeling, and novel neurotechnologies to precisely monitor and improve rehabilitation outcomes. I'm very looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. All right, so to motivate what we do in my lab, I want to say that how someone moves clinically tells us so much about their health information. And it's kind of a horrifying truth about clinical rehabilitation right now that we don't measure what we treat, even when we're treating movement. And the reason for that is that we don't really have accessible tools to measure how people move, to quantify that. And so we have, on one extreme, like high-quality motion analysis labs that take thousands of dollars, hours of setup time and post-processing to analyze. On the other hand, we have a stopwatch, which we widely use for the majority of our clinical outcomes assessments. And you can imagine if cardiology got rid of all their EKGs and their MRIs and their echoes, and they just only use a stopwatch and measured the pulse, we wouldn't really have the kind of cardiac outcomes that we have today. And so like a real driver for my lab is creating better technologies to allow us to measure movement in the real world. And we approach that through kind of a plurality of methods, including multi-camera, single camera, as well as wearable sensors, and then really focus on trying to make those produce clinically meaningful metrics. And so just to kind of continue making this point, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of people walking. And so if you look at this first person walking, you most likely don't really pick up any substantial gait impairments, and that would be correct. But now if we contrast it to this next individual, or these next two individuals, I guess, you'll see that they have asymmetric gaits, they have a stiff knee swing on one side, they're using a cane on the other side, and both of these are individuals with a stroke and hemiparesis all on the opposite sides. And then this next person kind of starts a little bit slowly, then they get going. At first they look like maybe they don't have a gait impairment, but if you look more closely at their arms and their trunk, you'll pick up some asymmetries. And this is an individual using a transfemoral amputee using a lower limb prosthesis. And then we can look at this next individual. Okay, and you can see that they're using a rolling walker. They've got a bit of a kind of adductor tones. Their limbs are swinging close together. And this is an individual with an incomplete spinal cord injury. And so just through this handful of anecdotes, you can see that we can pull out a lot of this health information just from looking at these movement patterns. And so to really try and get this into the real world, we've been so this is one of the hallways in our hospital at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, and you can see there's a suspended walkway through the middle so that we can work with people with all abilities using harnesses, and then you can see there's a series of cameras on either side of that walkway. And we've been working on this for a couple of years. There's a number of papers if you want to see some of our earlier methods. We have kind of nice little web applications. They kind of track all these experiments. They allow us to push them to databases, manage all this at scale. Now, an important thing for us is that most of the people we're working with can't walk without assistance, so there's often someone else nearby, and so we need to be able to even just separate things like that, and so we have these nice little GUIs. And then the end result is something like this, and so it's kind of a biomechanical analysis. Here you're going to see this person walking, and in a moment I'll show you them, or in the video, you'll see them walking a little bit later in rehabilitation. And you can look at these waveforms on the side, and you can kind of see that it's a little hard to see from this graph, but that they don't have very good hip extension. And then as we see in this later graph, that they've actually improved that. Their walking speed is improved. And so we're really excited about these ability to get these tools out in the real world, or in my real world, the clinic, outside of the laboratory, and look at people quantitatively. And so I don't want to talk too much about the methodologies, but one of the things that we've been really pushing on is in a lot of the approaches where people are using computer vision to rerun the kind of analyses that would be done in a biomechanics lab, they really copy the workflows that are used in biomechanics labs. And normally that involves taking a set of markers which are tracked really precisely, at sub-millimeter resolution. So you have these kind of kinematic trajectories of the virtual markers, and as a second stage, you do inverse kinematics on that. And what we've been pushing on is that separating these two stages when you're working with AI and computer vision isn't really optimal, because the kind of measurement properties are very different. In this case, there's a lot of noise in the images, or there's a lot more in the noise in the images. And so if you actually try and create these trajectories first and then separately do inverse kinematics, you throw away a huge amount of biomechanical information that actually could be informative, and it could tell you which of those computer vision detections are noisier. And so we've reframed this as sort of an end-to-end optimization problem, where on the left you see the representation of the trajectory. In this case, we use a neural network, although it doesn't necessarily have to be. It just has to be something learnable. This is a learned function that goes from time to joint angles, and then we can pass those through these biomechanical models, including scaling parameters that are used over multiple trials, and then we can pass it through our camera models and then measure the differences between the detected key points and the hypothesized key points, and then minimize that error over time, which then kind of, as we go through, it kind of converges, as you see on the right, and kind of starts to align with the person. And when we actually go and quantify these errors and compare them to things like an instrumented walkway, we're typically within about 10 to 15 millimeters of measuring gait parameters at kind of room scale. And so now with the system, we can deploy it in the clinic, as I alluded to, and you can see when we're looking at someone early versus later in rehabilitation, not only can you really see that their walking speed has improved dramatically, but we can actually then analyze their kinematics and see that, for example, this individual improved their hip extension range as well as their knee flexion. Now, what's nice about this representation, this kind of learned, optimized approach, sorry, this thing's clicking on me when I don't intend, is we can extend this to modeling dynamics through time. So we have this learned function that goes from time to joint angles, but because it's a function, we can take the derivative, which gives us time and joint velocities. We can augment this representation to also include actions or torques, and then we can optimize that with little dynamical rollouts, essentially like a direct shooting method, and try and make sure not just that the initial time point joint angle is correct, but actually where it ends a few frames in the future is correct. The nice thing about this is it allows us to get kinetics as well, so torques and ground reaction forces, and that's what you're seeing here. And so this is an individual, again, early versus later during inpatient rehabilitation. And if I draw your attention to, for example, the top right plot about the knee, you can see there that the red trace, the impaired side, doesn't have very much knee flexion, and in the kind of below, you can see that their knee flexion is improved. But then if you look, I don't know if this pointer works. I also don't see red, so I can't see the pointer if it does work. So anyway, the torques at the knee also improve, and then similarly, while we can see both improvements in the hip kinematics, but we can also see improvements in the torques that are being delivered at the hip. So again, developing these methods, getting them out into the real world is giving us a lot more insights into these measurements. But then, of course, it's really important to us to actually be able to turn those around and give them back to our clinicians. And so I've been working closely with one of my colleagues, Miriam Rafferty, and we originally started and we were showing our clinicians all these the full-on waveforms like we'd look at it in the biomechanics laboratory, and they just don't care. They don't want that, right? So kind of this very user-centric design, iterating with our clinicians, trying to design dashboards that give them the kind of metrics they want. In this case, like, for example, metrics of symmetry, and let them explore that data at their own leisure. And so we're really trying to push this more and more and get it to where the clinicians actually want to use this data, because right now we live in this kind of chicken and the egg world problem where they haven't had access to this data, so they don't really care about this data, and they don't know how to use it in their clinical decision making, so they don't want to collect the data. So we really want to break that cycle. Now, we're not just interested in gait, but we're also interested in arms. And so what's nice is this approach can be extended to both the arm and the hand. So on the left, this is some work we did last year, where we actually, thankfully, one of my colleagues had a data set where they'd been collecting paired marker-based data collection with multi-camera video. And so we applied those methods there. What we see is in the elbow and the shoulder, we're within typically a couple of degrees of tracking error. And actually what's quite nice is if we really delve into the variability across sessions, we see that there's actually less session-to-session variability with the markerless approaches than there is with the marker-based, because just marker placement errors can really create systematic biases day to day. What's also really nice is that we can now start to track the individual joints in the hand down to about 4 millimeters precision, which is what you're seeing on the right. And again, you can imagine sensorizing, putting markers on every joint in the hand is just both impractical, but is also going to change the hand kinematics themselves. So we're really excited about to get out there and measure that, although a real challenge of measuring hand and arm usage is that the entropy and how we use it is so much greater than with walking, where the metrics are a lot simpler. Nonetheless, we can look at things like wheelchair propulsion, and this is really important because people who use wheelchairs have very high rates of shoulder pathology as well as wrist pathology. And so now we can really measure this out in the real world at scale. When we, for example, look at the propulsion kinematics at the wrist for people stratified by whether this is two individuals, one with a cervical spinal cord injury and one with a paraplegia, you can see very different differences in their wrist kinematics. And if I go back to that prior video, I don't know how well it'll come across, but if you kind of look at this is an individual with tetraplegia, and you can see that they don't have a full grasp pattern. So their kind of hand as they're grasping it closes just more at the distal joints. And in rehabilitation, as I mentioned, we have our stopwatches. It's kind of what we mostly use, and we measure a lot of things. And I think this is a really informative example. So here, this is someone doing one of the assessments called the capabilities of upper extremity task. So in this particular part of the task, he has to reach up repeatedly. Now you can see, if you watch the humerus angle and the elbow extension angle, as they go through this trial, they start to fatigue, their humerus doesn't come up as high, and their elbow becomes less extended. And that's what you're seeing also in those waveforms on the left column. And you can compare that to another individual on the right who actually doesn't fatigue, and even though both of them would get essentially the same count score on this task. And in fact, if you look at the elbow flexion kinematics in the lower right, you can see they're actually using more of a double bend strategy versus this individual. So again, having more and more sensitive measures of how people are functioning. And all this is really well and good. And in a hospital setting, we can install these multiple cameras. I mean, it requires a little bit of engineering work, but it's not too big of a problem. But still, we'd like to get it even more out in the real world, right? And like in most clinics, we're not going to install these things, but everyone has a smartphone. And so we've been really trying to push on single camera as well as our multi-camera approaches. And so this is a preprint that just recently came out. And what JD's been working on is ways that we can extend this differentiable biomechanics approach that I've been describing to actually to single camera data. And you can see here, even though that camera is rotating, that person's being tracked stably in world space, because we can take all the sensor data from the phone, which tells us about the phone's rotation, and disambiguate that from the person's rotation. And then that kind of upper right plot, you're seeing the comparative pelvis position between these two systems, and they're pretty good agreement. And now we can get it out in the real world. So for example, I really like this story on the left with a neurosurgeon who wanted to look at how people's walking changes after cervical myelopathy decompression surgeries. And they'd been trying to do this study for some time, and part of that was to get people to go across the campus and then go to a formal biomechanics laboratory. And their recruitment was just really struggling. But once they brought the camera into the clinic, suddenly we could get all of this data at scale. And similarly on the right, this is another collaboration with a project where they're looking at function over longevity. And typically they're just measured outcome measures with a stopwatch, but now we can add these detailed quantitative kinematics with just a smartphone. And when we really delve into the metrics underlying this and break it down, you can see in this busy plot, essentially this is stratifying our errors by a number of different things, including what people's diagnosis is, or what joints we're looking at, or what activities they're doing. And by and large, we see that most of the time we're tracking most joints within 5 degrees, a lot of times closer to 2 or 3 degrees. And that's all well and good. But another thing that really matters is, can this actually pick up on clinically meaningful differences? And so that's what you're seeing in these figures on the right, is when, for example, we go and stratify our people controls versus people that use a lower limb prosthesis who have a transtibial amputation versus people with transfemoral amputations. And we use this holistic gait measure called the gait deviation index, where 100 is normative data. You can see that as people have more substantial amputations, they have a lower GDI. Similarly, when we look at people in the inpatient rehabilitation hospital who've had an assessment called the Berg Balance Scale done, which is used to reflect balance and stability, people whose Berg Balance Scale puts them in the high fall risk category have a lower GDI, and then people in the low risk category have a higher GDI, but those are still lower than the normative data. And then going back to that neurosurgical cohort that I mentioned, we actually saw that people who had an outcome on this measure called the Modified Japanese Orthopedic Association score, who functioned worse, also had worse GDIs. And what was quite nice is the MJOA is what's routinely used in surgical follow-up in these cases. And what we found is that the GDI is actually more of a responsive metric after surgery than the MJOA. But this is about neuroscience in the real world, and so we want to see if we can actually get out of the lab. And what's nice is you can even take a drone these days, tell it to follow people autonomously, set aside the creepiness of that, and then you can actually get things like running biomechanics, right? And what's nice about this is you get very nice reproducible biomechanics out in the real world. And so we're really excited about that. I don't do much running. I do more neuro rehab, so I don't know what we're going to do with this, but it's fun. Okay, and so this is all enabling us to get big rehabilitation data, but what are we going to do with that, right? And that's really kind of what we've been struggling with after the first couple of years of getting these methodologies working. So one thing I'm pretty excited about is using imitation learning to learn how to copy people's movement. And let me kind of unpack this a little bit. So in this study in the upper right from a couple of years ago, we were working with some model-free methods where we'd train an algorithm to look at movement and spit out gait parameters. And it worked fairly well. But the problem was, it's trained on a lot of data where there's real-world physics at play, but it doesn't have a physics model in the process when it's doing inference, which allows it to make like nonsensical statements like that someone's stride times their cadence doesn't equal their walking speed, right? But that's basic physics. So in that paper, what we showed was just reinstalling a physics simulation of someone moving into that actual inference process improved our estimates accuracies while also making them physically coherent. So this got us really excited about getting the physics closer and closer into our processes. And so this more recent paper, we kind of extended that to use a more realistic biomechanics model. And this is, again, where we have benefits. We're using this simulator called Mujoko. So not only does it give us this differentiability that I mentioned earlier, but it's highly parallelizable and GPU accelerated. And so what we can do is we can take this massive data set of all these movements we have, and I'd say it's probably one of the larger data sets of human movement, particularly when you're talking about people with impaired movements. And we train a single policy to copy all of those movements. And what that does is it takes the current state of the physics simulation and some future observations of the movement and figures out what forces are required to actually copy those movements, right? And so it's a generalized policy of the inverse dynamics problem. And so this is just kind of an example of someone walking. On the left, you're going to see the target trajectory that's captured either from a computer, smartphone, or from a multi-camera system. And then on the right, you're seeing that actually reproduced in the physics simulator. And the nice thing is this actually tracks within about a degree for most of the joints. Even though it's now having to run a dynamic simulation, it gives us ground reaction forces, it gives us muscle torques, or I'll talk about muscle activations in a minute. And by and large, it doesn't fall down most of the time, though sometimes it does. And so then, here's just an example on the upper left. And so that top row is showing you the kinematic inputs and the kinematic outputs, which are indistinguishable. You can't really see. But then below that, we're seeing the velocities. And then below that, we're seeing the torques that are in play. These traces here are actually the center of pressure measured from an instrumented walkway, as well as our physics rollouts, showing it reproduces the kind of point of contact quite nicely. And what's really cool, this is a prosthesis user. And you can see there's an asymmetry in those blue and red arrows that go up. The anterior component of the ground reaction force on their prosthetic side is reduced compared to the intact side. So it's starting to pick up these kind of clinically meaningful things. And when we look at the reproducibility over multiple days, it's pretty stable like that, although there's a lot of validation work to do for this. And because of the way this is learned, we can also extend it to neuromuscular models. So here you're seeing someone's kinematics on the left, and then it's actually replicating that by driving a physics model that actually has muscle activations there. And again, for our stroke, this is an individual with a stroke. We do see a reduction in the anterior component of the ground reaction force on that side. And we also pick up plausible asymmetries in the muscle activations. And again, there's a lot of validation to do for this. So that's one thing we're really excited about. Another thing that we're excited about, and actually the scene was well set when we just had a great discussion about foundation models. And so in the same way that we were hearing about tokenizing different modalities of data from the brain, we can tokenize movement data, right? And so we can take a language model, and then we can essentially train it in a new foreign language. So we take a series of movements, we train a tokenizer so that those movements become action sentences in some abstract sense. And then we can create data sets with all these things we know clinically about people. What is their diagnosis? Do they have a gait impairment? Do they have a history of falling? What's their performance on various functional tasks? And so you'll have a whole bunch of example data that's foreign language action sentence. Does this person have a history of falls? And then the answer, yes or no. And in the upper right, you can see all the different tasks that we trained it in right now, although we're just continuing to grow this. Dang it. No. Go. All right. Here's an example of it going. And so I can't see the screen well. Oh, there we go. So first I'm asking, what are they doing? It's saying overground walking, which seems a little trivial, but actually, even when you start working with people with severe gait impairments, most of the pre-trained algorithms for activity recognition do absolutely terribly. Especially with people with very slow cadences, you can see it's doing a good job of figuring out that this person has an amputation. It gets that one wrong, but nothing's perfect yet. And so yeah, we're really excited about this. I won't let this play, or maybe I'll just show one more. And here's, I think, going to do a timed up and go. So, it works nicely. And then just kind of as an aside, whenever you're talking about language models, especially in medicine, right, I think this is real temptation to hear the word AI and just be like magic, right? Or like, think artificial human intelligence and this can't be quantified. But I think it's particularly for any kind of clinical applications, it's so important to be very concrete about the tasks that you think that this can do in medicine, whatever those tasks are, and then develop metrics to measure that and then see if it's actually doing usefully. And so in the case of Biomech GPT, we really wanted to say, okay, well, the tasks are things like activity recognition, impairment diagnosis, assistive devices, and so we can really measure those. We can look at the confusion matrices. You can see it's doing quite nicely. Now, this plot here, or this row here, is actually quite an interesting one. So one of the things we saw was that if we only trained on 2 tasks, this is the performance, so 93 and 84. But then as we added in more and more tasks, the performance on those first 2 sets of tasks actually improves. So this is an example of positive transfer learning, right? Rather than training separate different classifiers for each problem, by training this one monolithic system, it gets a deeper and deeper understanding of human movement that actually allows it to generalize better to new tasks. And so that's why we're also excited about continuing to push on this. It also gives a nice natural language interface to our clinicians, which I'll talk about more. And so we're excited about it being somewhat of a powerful and general tool. I've just made all these points. But of course, it's really important to mention the cons. So for example, hallucinations you often hear about with language models. In this case, hallucination is it just makes the wrong answer, but it's just as confident sounding when it makes the wrong answer as it is when it makes the right answer. And so it doesn't really give us interpretability about what features in the movement it actually used to make those conclusions. And so that's also a limitation. And so, this is a little bit like if you're familiar with System 1 and System 2 in cognitive psychology, right? This is System 1 style, right? It sees something that makes an impression, right? But sometimes we actually want to analyze it. And honestly, I spent a lot of time thinking, is this stupid? Because we're taking the raw biomechanics, right? And then we're embedding it into some abstract space. And then we're spending all this effort to train a language model to understand what was in the raw data originally, especially if we do things like cadence, right? So another thing we can do is actually train, or not train in this case, but use foundation models and just ask them to analyze the data, right? And so here I asked it to pull up some data from someone, make a plot of their knee kinematics. I think I even told it to zoom in on them and find the middle. And then after that, look at the graph it just produced and then tell me what side they have hemiparesis on. And it does that pretty well. And what's really fun is I tried to do this about 2 years ago, and it was costing about $20 in cloud compute credit to get about 50% right for simple questions. Now I've had a student working with the system nonstop for 2 weeks, and I think we've burned through about $10 of credits. So and it's almost always correct. So this is pretty fun. Okay. And I only have a few minutes left, but you'll notice so far I've talked a lot about measuring things, maybe analyzing some of the data we got, but I haven't really made anyone better, right? And I haven't even really articulated a plan for how we might use this data to make someone better, and that makes me sad because I'm a physician. And I can't work a clicker. And so one of the solutions we've been thinking about to this problem is called the causal framework for precision rehabilitation. And and this kind of came about because there were a lot of people in the rehabilitation space who said we should be measuring things, and I was like, that makes sense, right? I think I sold you guys on it at the beginning, maybe. But then when you go back to those papers and say, why did we measure things? It wasn't really clear how to make anyone better. And so in rehabilitation, we have these distinctions between impairments of body structure and function, like detailed measurements about the human, and then how people function in the real world, which is how rehabilitation clinicians are really thinking about it. And ultimately, what I believe is that we need to start really building really high-quality causal models of how people function that span these levels of the ICF, right? That can sort of say, if your nervous system looks like this is the details of how we expect you to walk, this is how you're going to function in the real world, and if we can do these interventions, we'll change these nodes within your nervous system and thus change your real-world outcomes. And so just to kind of elaborate this on just a little bit briefly, So we have all this data we can collect currently. Now, a critical thing we don't typically collect is what we do to people in rehabilitation. Like, every time the Cochrane Reviews tries to do a meta-analysis in my field, they just give up and say, no one told us what they did, this is terrible, and they're not wrong. But there's kind of hope on the horizon. There's things like the Rehabilitation Treatment Specification System for better ways to document therapy interventions. So then if we kind of collect all of this data and then build the right kind of causal models. And so, here's just an example causal model on the left in the case of post-stroke gait, right? Where, I think that's what it is, yeah. So for example, you might start to model the effects of the corticospinal tract and the reticulospinal tract and how the RST drives more synergy and spasticity, whereas the CST drives more joint individuation. You might then start to say, well, based on this model, these are the kind of kinematic features I expect. These are the real-world outcome features. Then you might start to build in, well, if I do things like add functional electrical stimulation to the peroneal nerve during swing phase, then I expect that we're actually going to improve the ankle control, and that's going to allow them to walk with greater endurance and less metabolic expenditure. Kind of fitting things like these kinetic twins of people with all the kind of EMG that you can get from wearable sensors, which I didn't talk about today, but that's what you're seeing on the right. And then when we finally have fit this model, then you can use that to do in silico experiments. So this is going to be a sort of a foundation model of neurorecovery in this case. And then you can do experiments on this foundation model, and you can start to solve for what's called the optimal dynamic treatment regimen. And that's going to be a kind of a machine-learned rule of if you phenotype someone, and you measure all these things, what is the optimal intervention to give to them next in order to maximize their long-term outcome, which is a really critical distinction, right? And this is also involves search in a very complex, high-dimensional, nonlinear space. So we're gonna have to use tools like causal reinforcement learning and whatnot on these models to get there. And then I think I finished just about on time. So I'd really like to, especially in this day and era, thank all the funding sources, the NIH for their support, and of course everyone in the lab that's made this work possible. And I think I have a couple of minutes for questions. Perfect.
That was phenomenal. We need to give you a 3-hour slot for all the work that you're doing. Can I ask a question? So I think you're disease etiology agnostic right now, and I think that's great because the database is looking at behavioral output. But I wonder how your models will account for different disease etiologies in terms of predicting not just the impairment but potential for recovery, and how you sort of think about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I sort of am and I'm not. I mean, I think technology itself is disease agnostic, but then I think to make any one population better, you're going to have to get specific. And there are places where I probably ignore it at fault. So for example, understanding what the muscle-driven activity of a prosthetic joint is probably a stupid question that's built into my models sometimes. On the other hand, for example, my R01 is very concretely to look at how people move, the kinematic features that predict fall risk. Then we send them home with wearable sensors, and we capture every step they take in the real world, and ideally they don't fall, but if they do fall, the kinematics of those falls, and try and build specific causal linkages. There we'll have to build the right kind of causal models for that right clinical problem, just like I gave that example of post-stroke recovery, right? So I think the generalized tools of measuring movement are disease agnostic, right? And I have another line of work on wearable sensors for EMG biofeedback in spinal cord injury. The technology is disease agnostic. The games and the protocols we use in spinal cord look very different than the protocols you'd use in stroke when you're moving people out of synergy patterns. So that's kind of my long-winded answer.
It all comes together at the end.
Yeah. And for a while, we could kind of afford to ignore it because the computer vision was so terrible. We had to make that better, and now that's working. That's why I have to work on the harder problems, unfortunately.
Yeah, very interesting talk. I'm interested in the biomech, GPT, and agent. If you don't mind, can you talk more about that for maybe for the sake of transparency? So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very open-ended question. And so I guess my longer meandering thought that I think is interesting there, right, is, as I said, there's kind of this tension in my mind in terms of tokenization and representation learning. I think is really important, right? Like having the right representation of data, and I think that's kind of what we heard a lot in the first talk as well today. You know, like if you have the right representation, certain things can become linear, that can be very powerful. And so the tokenization is something we've focused a bit on now. And then of course, alongside that is developing the right database and the set of tasks and quantifying things. I'd say just kind of like outlining my roadmap. Then we have the biomech agent, right? It can write code and it can kind of, we're still developing the benchmark to prove how accurate it is on the code writing and figure out what tasks it can do and what tasks it can't do. I think that sort of the next step will be fusing those two with an additional piece. So there's a kind of like if you guys saw in the news earlier this year when DeepSeek came out, right, and NVIDIA's stock price tanked because there was this technique called reinforcement learning from verifiable feedback that was used to develop a kind of emergent, I'm using the word in quotes, but emergent reasoning abilities of language models when you had the correct answer. And so I'm hoping we can use the biomech agent to kind of create reinforcement learning for verifiable feedback to then have a deeper kind of system one impression of the tokenized movements, but then also the ability to give reasoning for the answers and then also be able to write code for that, right? So I hope they'll all kind of come together to build a very rich agent for biomechanical understanding. And then there's, you know, kind of emerging work now going on in the concept of AI scientists that can then actually be turned loose on these data sets, start to develop hypotheses and explore them, and then kind of correlate them with some other tools we've been creating to go and analyze all our therapy notes and pull out things like the rehabilitation treatment specification system. So I don't know if that's an answer to the question, but that's a ramble.
Do you imagine that the results that you're collecting in the real world can help drive the deployment and the tuning of exoskeleton robots or implantable devices for prostheses for gait?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to that is I absolutely do. And my R01 is entirely around prostheses. And so I think there we'll start to identify particular things that are causal to falls and then be able to go and make interventions. And same with kind of electrical neuromodulation. I think this will give us the sensitive, like for example, in that upper extremity task I showed, that was in a biofeedback study for EMG, for spinal cord. And I think this will allow us to tune those protocols.
Thank you.
One theme in all of your talks is, of course, computational model. What I want to ask about is something else, is visual feedback or user interface feedback that is somehow in all of your talks, whether it's like interacting with the GPT or an app or visual feedback in navigation. That seems to be like another theme in addition to the computational theme. So can you like touch upon that to get started?
Well, visual feedback is super important, obviously, right? In all of our stress sensing work, we found very early on that if you start showing people they're stressed out, they get more stressed out. So you don't want to do that. So you want to do the opposite almost. You want to like help them understand when's a good time to not, to prepare to not be stressed out later, right? So we had to learn that the hard way. And yeah, there's some user interfaces we've designed that are just kind of more childlike, not professional enough, and I found that unless you make the user interface super professional, very polished, people won't use it. Parent Guardian was a great example. I didn't say that during my talk, but it was so well designed. It was very cartoonish, but it was very easy to remember. It was kind of iconic in terms of the intervention visual descriptions, and that's why the parents were able to memorize it really quickly. So yeah, it's super important.
I guess I would just sort of trying to like almost tie the themes together. For me, there's you want to target the like where people what they want from it, right? And it almost gets like their belief states to like the kind of beliefs they're trying to extract about it. So as we've been trying to develop interfaces for our clinicians, and even just kind of exploring this, it's going to look very different for different types of clinicians, right? So like a physical therapist is probably going to want an interface that still exposes the most data, but like less than maybe a biomechanist. And then you might have like the rehabilitation physician might want a little bit more information, maybe how it pertains to function. And then I could easily imagine in like PCP or neurology clinics, well, neurologists I don't want to speak to, but like PCPs would probably want an interface that very much looks like an alert. Just like someone walks in, hey, we've identified a new movement impairment. Like either this looks like the kind of thing where they should go to physical therapy, or this seems like the kind of thing they should go to a neurologist. And so I do think there's, and this kind of gets to the human-centeredness, right, as well. Like, so being very thoughtful about the interfaces. And I guess that's more interfaces than feedback, right? Because then when you get into like neurorehabilitation, there's like, EMG biofeedback, motor biofeedback, and then you really need to be embracing like what are the motor learning principles you're trying to drive, and then does that, the way you provide that feedback, like really induce those principles?
I think people are, so I mean, we have this idea of images, and we always think in terms of images. And I think when you look at natural behavior, if you look at what is the image on the back of the retina, if you're into eye tracking and you see this for the first time, you get this appreciation. Oh, that's not an image, right? So somehow culturally we think about these images and we do computer vision on the images, but what people process, that's so different. And I think in these tasks you get this appreciation how much the input is convolved somehow with your internal model, how a single eye movement may extract something and not process the image at all. There are some beautiful experiments in virtual reality where you can exchange all sorts of properties of objects while people are interacting with them. If those object properties are not relevant for the task, people don't notice. You can change the texture, the color. You can change all sorts of things. They continue doing something with these objects. It's fine if the task if it's not relevant for the task. So I think we tend to have this cultural idea of images and vision. And of course, it's relevant if you're looking at an interface on a computer monitor, but really this visual processing is very, very different, particularly in natural tasks.
I love that one illusion where you give that, it's that video where you ask people to count the number of times a basketball has passed, and then as it's playing, like this monkey just walks in, this person in a monkey suit just walks in, does a little dance, and like most people just don't see it, right?
Awesome talks, by the way. I just had a question regarding the use of AI and emotional well-being. So whenever I'm not a student, I work in special education, and a lot of the models that you discussed, like the parent guardian and the pop therapy, I felt like they would be very useful in the educational setting. And I know that you mentioned that you're not sure what it would look like if children had like access directly to the AI models, but I was wondering what it would look like in maybe an educational setting where teachers could use these models to detect meltdowns that may occur, or have just an assistant whenever students are getting very overwhelmed in the classroom.
Yeah, that's an application we talked about a lot. To really help students learn optimally, we want them at that right place in the Yerkes-Dodson curve, right? We don't want them to be bored. We want them to be engaged. So you could definitely use this kind of technology there. We also applied it to doctors. Turns out oncologists get less and less empathic the longer they are a doctor, because they have to tell people all this bad news for so long, so their bedside manner goes down. I don't know if that's true for teachers too, but we used some of these techniques to train doctors to be more empathic to their patients, to at least make them aware of when they weren't. And that was extremely helpful. So yeah, I think you could definitely apply it in the education space. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's been a really depressing theme I've seen for a number of the AI language models when there've been like head-to-head double-blinded trials of an AI chatbot versus a physician. Not only are the chatbots often like outperforming in terms of like diagnostic accuracy, but they like crush the physicians in terms of empathy. Now I think a lot of that's like a chat interface, right? And you got this one thing that has like infinite tolerance for typing incredibly long curated speech, and then I know I get bored typing, but.
I have a question from online. So this is toward Professor Rothkopf. How central is active perception, such as eye movements or exploratory behavior, to updating belief states in natural settings? Could this be modeled or measured meaningfully in complex environments like cities or neighborhoods without landmarks?
So, I mean, I think if you look at the psychological literature, people pretty early on picked up on this idea that somehow vision, particularly, is not passive, right? But it's tricky, I think, to quantify these things and to answer such a question if you don't have a model. Without a model, it's very difficult to say, well, was this eye movement, what was its purpose? So, of course, we don't always know what people's goals are when they are going, I don't know, shopping, to an appointment, just taking a walk out there in a cityscape. But I do think that's the way to go. So that's what we are also working on. I briefly mentioned the inverse modeling. So often we have experiments where we try to figure out what are the goals that people have in naturalistic behavior. So I think it's possible. It's difficult because we cannot characterize fully, well, what are the uncertainties they are dealing with. And landmarks, it's not landmarks only like a church, a big landmark, but many things are used as landmarks for people to orient themselves. So yes, absolutely, it should be possible. The question is how to model it, but we're working on it. And others are working on it too, of course.
Thank you. I wondered if you guys had an opinion on the kind of trust and the buy-in of people when we're kind of trying to look at everyday tasks, but we're using, you know, an online chatbot or a task that's in VR, for example, and how that's people's experience of that is changing over time. So, for example, if you rotate a landmark in the task, and people are like, oh, well, that wouldn't happen in the real world. Like, how is that informing people's behaviors, and we're judging how people will behave in the real world when these things don't normally happen? Or, for example, if the chatbot says something that they don't agree with, if there's an immediate like, well, I don't trust this anymore, how do we keep people kind of engaged in that, and how is that changing over time as we become more reliant on technology?
I actually did an experiment on that a long time before AI got so popular. I looked at an AI system that would give you advice on a puzzle called Boggle. And if the advice was 80% correct, even when it went down to 20%, like after 10 minutes, it started just saying really wrong things. Users kept using it. But if it started out at 20%, after 10 minutes, they wouldn't even use it anymore, right? And we looked at trust in other ways too. We looked at things like beauty and things like that in agents. People are very finicky. You know, if an AI system doesn't work out the box, I think it's not going to be trusted and it won't be used. So you have to make sure that these things are very trustworthy. We did a lot of work on that, honestly.
I mean, I guess I would also just say in the biomechanics space too, at the other extreme, sometimes those things that are non-physiological or plausible are therapeutic. And so like, it's funny, there's some perturbation study papers I've read where they were trying to use it as a readout on the status of the nervous system, but plasticity was so pronounced that like single trial perturbations, and then people's behavior totally changed, right? But then that can actually be used therapeutically to change behavior in the real world and make people more robust to falls.
Yeah, you nailed it exactly. There was one data point that on all the slides wasn't modeled correctly. That was when the landmarks were rotated 115 degrees. And what happens in that condition, participant in the beginning, they may think, oh, something is funny here. But towards the end of that session, that block of trials, they totally don't rely on the landmarks anymore because they're thinking, these psychologists are just playing some trick on me. I completely disregard the landmarks. So, yes.
Thank you. It's fantastic comments and answers. Let's thank the speakers again. With that, we're at time, and we're going to go to lunch break.